Week we were looking at Jesus' attitude toward the Samaritans under two major points. The second of those was that Jesus does not accept that Jewish bitter spirit. And we had 2 points under that. The second one being the texts that teach Jesus' friendly attitude toward the Samaritan people. And I gave you 3 of those. And we're going to finish that by looking at the fourth and final one tonight. So we're under Jesus' friendly attitude toward the Samaritan people. We gave you Matthew 10, 5, and 6. That was the first text supporting that, which shows that although Samaritans are not Jews, they're also not Gentiles. They are a unique people. We're going to conclude tonight by bringing their history right up into modern times. And we need to appreciate the fact that according to some of these passages, like Matthew 10, 5 to 6, and another one we'll mention here later on, they are a unique people, a very, very ancient sect. They are not Jews. They are not Gentiles. A second passage we gave you was Luke 10, 30 to 37, the parable of the certain Samaritan, who was a good man. The third one was Luke 17, verses 11 through 19. Here we were dealing with that reading in the KJV that should better be translated something along the line that he traveled along the border of Galilee and Samaria. And as he was going, then he met various lepers, 10 of them. And 9 of them were Jewish, so they would have probably come from Galilee. And the 10th one was a Samaritan. And since lepers often lived in colonies together, then it might well be supposed that there was a Jewish Samaritan colony of lepers. Unless you think, well, Jews and Samaritans didn't have any dealings with one another. Whenever you're a leper, you don't have dealings with anybody. So you're looking for friends. So it seems like that he met a leper colony that was mostly a Jewish leper colony. And they had at least one Samaritan in the group. That's kind of interesting, the ratio there. If we could deduce anything from above about that the Jewish people, because they had been given more truth and more light, were cursed with the greater curse. But that would be my hypothesis. Not mine, just a hypothesis. And then we come to John 4. John 4 tonight. It'll be the fourth passage. This is certainly the most detailed passage in the New Testament dealing with the Samaritans, and also the most famous. And what makes it doubly interesting, or let me change that, what makes it triply interesting is that, number one, it highlights Jesus' good attitude toward the Samaritans, unlike any other New Testament passage, because of the length of the passage. 2, unlike any other passage, he doesn't deal just with a Samaritan, but what's different about this chapter? It's a woman. And thirdly, what type of woman? One of very dubious character. So I would rank John 4 as even more important, more significant, more famous than Luke 10, the parable of a certain Samaritan. Because after all, Luke 10 is a parable. It does not purport to be the story of a true, reliable historical account. John 4, however, is a true historical account. It's not a story told to illustrate a point. It really did happen. All of the figures in it are genuine historical figures. All of the details are genuine historical details, and so forth. So we've got a triply interesting passage. It's longer than any other. Unlike any other, all the others we've looked at, Jesus is dealing with male Samaritans, or it's just Samaria or Samaritan without any reference to gender. And here it's a woman. And then as we'll see down around verse 17 and so forth, she was a very dubious moral character. And so what we have then is, in this story that John gives us, which is true, Jesus breaches 3 Jewish hostilities. Really the 3 that I just given you, but you need to realize this. That's why probably so much time and space has been given to it. Jesus breaches 3 Jewish hostilities or no-nos. He talks to a Samaritan. He talks to a female Samaritan. The Jews didn't like Samaritans, and the Jews had a rather low view of womanhood and of women. And thirdly, the woman's a very low moral character. And being a Jewish rabbi, which is what we should see Jesus as, because that's the way a lot of his enemies saw him. A rabbi, he was going around trying to gather some disciples after him. Then obviously if you're a Jewish rabbi, then you're one that's venerated. The people look up to you. You have to hold to the traditions. And you've broken 3 of them in one swing of the bat by going into Samaria, talking to a Samaritan woman, and if that's not enough, she's a very low, dubious moral character. And then, of course, the whole climax of the story is this Samaritan woman who's of low moral character is offered eternal life by the Son of God. Oh. And he didn't ever give that offer to those rabbis and Sadducees and Pharisees back in Jerusalem. It's a beautiful story. We won't have the time to render unto it the time that we need, that it deserves, because we're looking at it just from the point of view of what can we learn about Samaritanism and Jesus' attitude toward them. It's so powerful, the story here, which goes all the way down to verse 42. That's 42 verses. It's so powerful and so instructive that we cannot hope to really do it justice tonight. But we'll do our best. Let's start back in the first few verses, and I'll kind of outline some of this. If John intends for us to understand, and we're not studying life of Christ or the Gospel of John, so we can't get into all the various details and theories about this and trying to construct an itinerary, a chronology. But if John intends for us to understand that chapter 4 does immediately follow chapter 3, not just, well, you say, I know 4 comes after 3, but chronologically that whatever was happening in chapter 3 in that time is immediately followed in that time with the events of chapter 4, then it's going to put Jesus somewhere near Jericho. Because we've had the baptism of John and the baptism by Jesus' disciples being discussed back in verses 22 and 23 of John 3. So he's in Judea, and we're even told this in chapter 4, and that seems to indicate that chapters 3 and 4 really do go together. That's not always true. Luke, for instance, is one who seems to have the habit, although he's very precise on describing people and places and so forth, he seems to have the habit finishing a chapter and then starting into the next one with the first phrase being, and at that time, and then he tells us something, and you can look at the preceding chapter and the one you're studying now, and they simply do not fit together. So when he says at that time, he does not mean at that time that I've just been talking about. He just means, and at that time. It's just a way, a figure, a style, a Lucan style that he uses. He's thinking about it in his mind, and he says at that time. And it didn't happen at the time of the earlier chapter. So those are little tidbits. You learn that, and you learn to interpret Scripture better. And the book of Acts is the same. You know, he goes from chapter 5 into chapter 6, and you don't exactly know the time lapse between the two chapters. And you find that over and over again in his writings. And you find it in other writers. I'm not saying that Luke is guilty of something that's a serious breach of the laws of the writing of history, or that's not found in other writers. But John seems to imply that the two chapters go together, because Jesus appears to be in Judea in chapter 3, and he's in Judea in chapter 4. And that will become significant here in a moment. When therefore the Lord knew how the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John. Now see, verse 1 is interesting right away. Why do you go from the Lord, that word, to Jesus? When therefore the Lord knew. Seems like John is, thinking back on this. But when the Lord, and he's telling the story, when the Lord knew how the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made Now he's gone to Jesus instead of Lord. Well, probably what we have there, of course, is the way the story would have been told to the Pharisees. How did the Pharisees hear that whoever made and baptized more disciples than John? Well, I doubt someone came and said the Lord is doing it, because they wouldn't have believed he was the Lord, and neither would the person who reported it. So they probably gave him his name. Jesus is baptizing. Made and baptized more disciples than John. And then John has to, and this is an interesting verse, it's in parenthesis here in verse 2, because the implication in verse 1 is that Jesus actually did the baptizing. If you didn't have verse 2, you would know otherwise, that's for sure. And it becomes an important text among other reasons for a study of biblical hermeneutics. Sometimes you may think that you have the inference from the verse because it's so obvious. What if you didn't have verse 2 here? Wouldn't you go away from the passage saying Jesus actually himself with his own hands baptized disciples? And you'd be dead wrong, though. Say, well, then how do we know whether? Well, sometimes you don't know. Here we do, though. Though Jesus himself baptized not, but his disciples. Why didn't he? I mean, there's so much here in this chapter we can't get into. He made the disciples, and then his disciples baptized them. But we really need to start in verse 3. That's really the beginning of the chapter for our purpose tonight. Verses 3 and 4. Let me kind of sum up and then we'll read verses 3 and 4. Problems of fame cause him to leave southern Palestine and travel north. You can take fame in a positive sense, or you can take it in a negative sense. When the Pharisees knew what he was doing, I would take it in a negative sense. It's not like he was going to be mobbed by adoring fans, but that the Pharisees would be after him to persecute him. He has to leave southern Palestine and travel north. But how's he going to travel? Remember we discussed last week, you got two different ways you can travel north. You can either go straight through Samaria, or you can cross the Jordan River and go through Perea and Decapolis. So how does he go? Through Perea? Well, we know the chapter's about Samaritan woman, so it has to be Samaria. He left Judea, verse 3, you see, we know that he's there, and departed again into Galilee. So we know there are two different ways you can get to Galilee. Verse 4, and he must needs go through Samaria. So we're told, we don't have to guess his itinerary here. We're told how he made his way from Judea to Galilee, and that was through Samaria. Now, it becomes important, the note that I gave you earlier, the fact that in chapter 3, well, according to chapter 4 and verse 3, as well as according to chapter 3, Jesus is actually in Judea, and he's over by the Jordan River. I mean, that's where you're going to do your baptizing, verses 1 and 2. Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John. It's over near the Jordan River. And so if we put our map back up here, with our Jordan River, with Jerusalem, with Samaria, with Jericho, that means Jesus is somewhere around here. And you see that the technical Jews, whenever they're going from Judea to Galilee, they go from Jerusalem down, we're even told that it's down, and it is, down 1,500 feet over in Luke 10. The 1,500 feet aren't given to you, but it is down, that a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among thieves. They'd go down to Jericho, cross the river through Perea, through Decapolis, and cross back over the River Jordan, just south of the Sea of Galilee. Well, if he's already down here, you've already taken a long way out of the journey. The easiest, quickest way to go would be just to continue the regular Jewish way, and that is right through Perea and Decapolis and cross back over Jordan River into Galilee. The fact that he goes in this direction, to go through Samaria to go to Galilee, is very highly unusual. You see, if he's already in Jerusalem, we could understand that he might want to do that. Surely some Jews did do that because it was extra time, extra effort, extra expense to go the roundabout long way. You would really have to want to avoid the contact of the Samaritan people. And so look what John tells us, and this is in the Greek. This isn't just something in the KJV. In verse 4, he must needs go through Samaria. You could drop the needs out, he must needs, because we don't talk like that, but he must go through Samaria. So various theories have arisen as to what this means, that he must go. In other words, it wasn't just a choice that was not based on any important reason. He must go through Samaria. When we say that a person must do something, there's a reason behind it. It isn't just, well, 6, 1, half a dozen, I selected it because that's the first thing I thought of today. One theory, I won't give you all the theories, I'll just mention a couple of them. One theory is the theory of time element. That, he must be about his father's business. He's in a hurry. It's the shortest way. So he goes through Samaria. But all the things that I just said are not necessarily true. Since you're already at Jordan River, I wouldn't call going through Samaria the shortest or the easiest way. Because the Jordan River is in what we call the Rift Valley there of Palestine that extends miles and miles. In other words, you're down low. The Dead Sea is 1,300 feet below sea level. You've got quite a climb to go from Jericho back up through northern Judean hills, back up through southern Samaritan hills to get up into some level area. It's a very, very difficult journey. I've traveled through there. I know how difficult that is. It would be a lot easier to stay right around the Jordan River, just cross over on the other side and go up through Perea and through Decapolis. As far as time element concerns, if he is concerned about time, it'd be quicker to go up through Perea and Decapolis. So I don't think that time element. I think that probably what we have, and this is another theory. John doesn't tell us why. So you have to reconstruct what you think is the best alternative among the various proposed theories. What does John mean by he must go through Samaria? What I think that he means is that there's a theological, soteriological import to this statement that Jesus' mission was ultimately to the whole world. And it's characteristic of the New Testament authors to drop little hints of this on the way to the completion of their story. I'll say that again. It's characteristic of the biblical authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, to drop little hints of the fact that his mission is ultimately to the whole world on the way to their fuller development of that. Take, for instance, what we've looked at earlier in this class, the fact that Luke very conspicuously drops in that little subject of Rome right in chapter 2 of the book of Acts. We find out later that his whole book is geared toward that city, to the city of Rome. And he drops Rome in. Strangers, proselytes from Rome, which is unusual to find that early. The author we're discussing now, John, over in chapter 12, has it recorded that some Greeks came to the disciples of Jesus and said, "Sirs, we would see Jesus." And then nothing much more said about them in John chapter 12, a passage that we also have discussed in this class earlier. And I think I said whenever I brought that up, we have a hint there of the ultimate outreach and mission of Christianity, that it won't be just to the Jewish people, that it will be to the Greeks, to the Gentiles of John 12. And earlier than that, John 4, it will be to the Samaritan people as well. So you might not have ever caught that in John 4:4, but I think we have a theological verse here that's easy to pass over because, it involves names, and a lot of people don't like itineraries and geography, and so they skip over things like that. But he must needs go through Samaria because of what chapter 4 is going to develop here. And we're going to see, by virtue of the fact he offers a Samaritan woman, and immoral Samaritan woman, eternal life, that the ultimate goal of his mission is the whole world and not just the Jewish people.
I kind of have a hypothetical question, but I'm just wondering about the possibility of it, that if the Jewish people would have received Jesus Christ at that time, and his first coming, would it be possible then for the kingdom to be established right then and there?
Well, it's kind of like asking the question, will men in the resurrection get all their fingernail and toenail clippings back? You know, you got to be a complete man. And the scholastics in the medieval period sat around and discussed that, you know, all the time. And will you get your toenail clippings back? Will you get your fingernail clippings back? You read a little in theology and you'll see that's what some of the scholastics sat around and did. Maybe that sounds like a put down to your question, but at least you did preface it correctly, that that's a hypothetical question. So all I can give you is a hypothetical answer. And that'd be yes, the kingdom could be established then. But that doesn't really answer the question. I think the question that you need to be asking, or that you should intend to ask, is then, well, what would have happened to the Gentiles? Surely the kingdom could have been established. That seems to be implied by Jesus in the Gospels. But it would have been a Jewish kingdom. Then what would have happened to the Gentile people? But since you didn't ask that question, I won't answer that then. Verses 5 and 6. And I'll go on before anybody else has an opportunity to pipe in. No, you may not. Verses 5 and 6 we'll come to next then. You understand verses 3 and 4 then? You ever notice that before? He must needs go through. Did you understand what it meant whenever you read it before?
Like I do now.
Okay. Wonder how many more verses are like that. Wonder how many more there are like that I haven't seen. So if we get all of our heads together, then we ought to have at least half of the truth. Verses 5 and 6 present textual problems with this word psychar, which I just don't want to get into tonight because it does become a little involved. I'll just say, I'm just tempted to say just a thing or two about it, though. If we give ourselves the Sea of Galilee again, the Dead Sea in Jerusalem, and then what was the northernmost of the two mountains, Ebal and Gerizim? Ebal, Gerizim, Samaria, the city, Shechem, and Sychar. Okay? Now, that's one theory, that Sychar is the modern-day Ascar. You'll see why this is important, although we're not really going to get to the point of answering it. That Sychar is the modern-day Ascar, which is a different city than the ancient Old Testament Shechem. Where we have Jesus located in this chapter is in Sychar. But you see there are textual variants here. Sychar is one, Shechem is another. And those are basically two choices. Then cometh into a city of Samaria. So when he uses Samaria here, John means the whole country, not the capital city of Samaria, which I've just shown you where it is in relation to these other four places, 2 mountains and 2 cities, which is called Sychar, near to the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. So you'd have to do some Old Testament study and see kind of what that meant. Now, Jacob's well was there. You don't have any Old Testament reference for Jacob's well. So you would have a problem there. Concerning Jacob giving a parcel of ground to Joseph, you could look up scriptures that talk about that, but you couldn't find one dealing with Jacob's well. Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat thus at the well, and it was about the 6th hour. So, you know, it's about evenly divided, I guess. On the manuscript, you really can't go too much on the manuscript. It's about evenly divided, so you got to go. Other methods of investigation. To sum it up tonight, the commentators are about evenly divided as to whether or not Sychar is a separate place. I know one theory that I just recently read says that Sychar and Samaria are two different places. That Shechem and Sychar are two different places, and that Shechem is the place that has, because down traditionally to this day, Shechem is the place that has the traditional site of Jacob's well. Sychar, about a mile or less northeast of Shechem, has another well that is not the same. The problem with that theory, and a lot of people hold to that, the problem with that theory that I can see immediately without thinking too much more about it, is the fact that if we do accept Sychar as the reading here in verse 5, then the woman tells us in verses 11 and 12 that the well from which she is drawing and drinking water is in fact Jacob's well, and she would have known what she was talking about. Art thou greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well? The well where? Well, if she's at Sychar, then Jacob's well has to be at Sychar. Because other people feel that the traditional Jacob's well is at Shechem, then they opt for the other theory. But let's don't even concern ourselves with that tonight. It doesn't make any difference for us right now. Jesus meets the woman at this place called Sychar. Maybe it's intended to be Shechem according to other manuscripts. We'll leave it Sychar, the way it is in the KJV. Near to the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey. I just described that it would be a very arduous journey to go from Jericho up, be going up several thousand feet from the Jordan River Valley, the Rift Valley, to the central land of Samaria. So that's proved by what we're reading here. Wearied with his journey. Sat thus at the well, and it was about the 6th hour, which in John's reckoning would be 12 o'clock noon. All right, then let's jump into verses 7 through 9. So we see that he's tired. It's the middle of the day. It's the hot time of the day. The disciples leave to buy some food in the city. That seems to imply that they are at Sychar, because the well is right in the city. You wouldn't have to go into the city to buy. But if you are at the well, Jacob's well in Sychar, you might go to the city of Shechem, which is about a mile southwest of Sychar, which would be in view, right in view of Mount Gerizim, to buy some food. And verse 7, a woman comes out to draw water at this very, very unusual hour. Women did their drawing of water just like everybody did just about everything in the cooler parts of the day. Early in the morning, late in the evening, not at noontime. Well, the theory is, and it's probably a good one, that she came at this time of the day due to her immoral character, so that she wouldn't meet anybody else at the well. No one else would be there drawing water. She knew that she could go there, draw water, and you know how women can be nasty toward one another? No women would be chatting and railing on her, you immoral woman, you immoral woman. I mean, she was known around the community for being an immoral woman. So she comes at the unusual time of 12 noon, right in the heat of the day, to draw water so she can be alone. See how God the Father has all of this sovereignly worked out here. And she's going to meet someone there who's not going to rail on her like the other Samaritan women would have. She may have had a spring, probably she did, closer to her. There are springs in this area. But her superstitious veneration would have told her that water from Jacob's well is to be preferred over water from the spring, when genuinely most people would prefer water from a spring than water from a well. So what seems to be said here, I'm giving you a lot of different details hurriedly so we can move on, is that although the woman is certainly immoral, she has some type of spiritual side to her. And this seems to be often implied in the Gospels. Take the Samaritan leper, the only one that was healed and returned to give thanks. Often it seems to be the people lowest down who truly have done a lot of immoral deeds. There's no question about that. Take the case in John 8 of the woman there. She seems to have more to her spiritually, even though she is an adulteress, than those Pharisees that accuse her. That seems to be often the case here in the Gospels. And that seems to be what Paul draws out in places like 1 Corinthians 1, that God chooses the weak and the foolish and the base and the despised. He doesn't choose the mighty and the intelligent, the rich and the powerful. Not many, Paul says. So he's genuinely thirsty. Here's the Son of God, but he's genuinely thirsty, which speaks of his human nature. He's genuinely weary, which speaks of his human nature. And he asks for a drink of water. Now, she tells us of him in verse 11 that he doesn't have a bucket. Buckets were made out of animal skins. They were sometimes called skin buckets. He's got no skin bucket, verse 11. Well, in all likelihood, the disciples have it with them in the town. Any traveling group would have to have a water bucket with them, because you're going to come across wells. How are you going to get water? You'd have to have your own skin bucket with you. So the disciples may have taken that in town with them. Let's read the verses now that I've given you a summary of them.
For the continued
Let's read the verses now that I've given you a brief summary of them. Then cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus saith unto her, Give me to drink. I hope I've painted enough of the background here. In other words, you've got two entirely radically different people, unusual people, a Samaritan woman that's immoral and the Son of God, meeting at an unusual time at the well. I mean, it's unusual for her to be there, not so much for him. He's traveling, but highly unusual for her to be there, except I think we know why she's there. Parenthesis, verse 8, his disciples are gone away into the city to buy some food. Perhaps that means Shechem, although we're not told. And he asked her, in verse 7, Give me a drink. Then saith the woman of Samaria, and here you've got a classic passage. How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? Notice she didn't just say a Samaritan. She goes on to say that at the end of the verse, but a woman of Samaria. How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. That one passage should substantiate everything that we've said thus far about all the problems, the feuds, the bitterness, the rivalry between these two groups of people. All you need is one passage to prove it, and John 4:9 will. Moffat gives an interesting translation here, tries to deliver it more powerfully. He has this, the woman saying, What? You are a Jew and you ask me for a drink? Me, a Samaritan? So gives James Moffat. Verse 10, Jesus answered and said unto her, If thou knewest the gift of God, and who it is that saith to thee, Give me to drink, thou wouldest have asked of him, and he would have given thee living water. The woman saith unto him, Sir, thou hast nothing to draw with. Now, sir doesn't necessarily mean what we would mean by sir. That's a title of respect to someone. Sir, it just means man or you or mister. Doesn't mean what we mean by sir, a title of respect. Sir or mister or man, thou hast nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. From whence then hast thou that living water? Art thou greater than our father Jacob? She had no idea he was going to say yes. I mean, this is a rhetorical question here, the answer being obviously no. No one could be greater than Jacob, except the God of Jacob, though. And the Samaritan woman would be willing to admit that, as we see she goes on to do. If she knows that she's met the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then, well, she'll take back that rhetorical question. Who gave us the well and drank thereof himself and his children and his cattle? And so Jesus doesn't get into the... And notice she goes back to Jacob. He's a great patriarch of the Jewish people, but the Samaritans would claim him as well because he's back in those pre-Joshua, pre-David, pre-Saul and Solomon days. Jesus answered and said unto her, Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again. But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. The woman saith unto him, Sir, or man, or mister, give me this water, that I thirst not. And I think she's really got a temporal concern mixed in with that. Neither come hither to draw. But she's also got a spiritual side to her. She wouldn't be responding in the end of the story as we know that she's going to respond. But she's got a temporal side to her. You know, if I can get some water, I mean, she doesn't even question. She starts asking for it right away. If I can get some water, I'll never have to come to this well. I won't have to be concerned about the Samaritan women crying at me and calling me all types of names. I want it to come in the middle of the day when it's hot. If I can just drink of this water that he speaks of, I'll never thirst again. I'll never come to this place to draw. And he said unto her, Go call thy husband and come hither. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. And Jesus said unto her, Thou hast well said, I have no husband, for thou hast had 5 husbands. Here we're given our first clue to her immoral background. We would know this otherwise. And once you know this, then you have to read the rest of the story like we already have, the earlier verses in light of it. And he whom thou now hast is not thy husband. In that saidst thou truly. So here the KJV for the third time is going to give us sir. I think we should have a better word in here, although maybe by this time she's more thinking of sir. It's becoming more and more an attitude of respect for this one with whom she's speaking. I perceive thou art a prophet. Well, she's getting closer. You were just a Jew in verse 9. Now you're a Jewish prophet. Well, you're getting closer. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain. Now, she has to be in the immediate vicinity of Gerizim, and she is, just a little over a mile northeast of Gerizim. And ye say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. So you've got an immoral woman, but she's up to date with the theology of the time, with the debate of theology between the Jews and the Samaritans. I mean, he hasn't said anything about what she starts discussing in verse 20. But she certainly shows her familiarity with that whole debate in Samaritan Jewish theology. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. And now he really astounds her. I mean, everything that he's been saying thus far has taken her one step or level higher in her spiritual walk and understanding. And now he just transcends all things. Woman, believe me, the hour cometh when ye shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship God, the Father. Now that went beyond what she could conceive a Samaritan saying, and especially a Jewish prophet saying. Ye worship ye know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Amen. Now, do you remember what I told you earlier, that the Samaritans were looking for a Messiah figure, Tahiv, which literally can be translated the restorer. He was the one who was to restore all things. Sometimes you'll come across things in your readings that will say that the Samaritans were really not messianic in their expectations. That Tahiv was like Elijah would be to the Jewish people, that he was to be a restorer and not actually a Messiah. But I think that's probably going a little too far. I believe they did have messianic expectations, and that Tahiv, although it literally means, can be translated a restorer, was a messianic restorer. So that's what they're looking for. Now look at verse 25. And I think verse 25 is going to prove my view. I just read today, and just reviewing a few things for what I wanted to say tonight. I've had these messages ready, of course, a long time, but I came across another reference to the fact that some Christian scholars today say that Tahiv was an Elijah-type restorer, not a messianic restorer. But look at verse 25. The woman saith unto him, I know that Messiah cometh. She's looking for Messiah. She's a Samaritan, who is called the Anointed, the Christ. When he is come, he will tell us all things. Now, he's just given her a revelation that could have only come from God back in verse 18. With a supernatural revelation of knowledge, a word of knowledge, Paul calls it in 1 Corinthians 12. That he will tell us all things. And he's gone beyond just a revelation of knowledge in verse 18 to this transcendent prediction in verses 21 through 23. That the hour is coming when you will neither worship in Gerizim, Samaria, Jerusalem, Judea, but you'll worship the Father in spirit and in truth. So she said, I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. You see, this woman, it's a beautiful story, even in her immoral condition that she's in, swapping off men, a half a dozen of them. She's actually got more insight to spiritual things than the religious leaders down in Jerusalem. And don't we all know that that's one part of the story that the Gospels labor to prove over and over? That the tax collectors and harlots will go into the kingdom of heaven before the religious leaders. Before the religious leaders in Jerusalem. That's what Luke 15 is all about. Jesus had some friends among that group of people, and then he is telling us in Luke 15 those three parables. You have to read the first two verses of Luke 15 to get the context of lost sheep, lost coin, lost son. So I really like this chapter, not because I'm a Samaritan immoral woman or something, but because it does say a lot to me about the type of people that Jesus has come to save and come to redeem, and the type of people that we should be looking for, and the type of people we should want to be friends with in the sense that Christ was, to share the message with them. You just generally don't get the higher-ups converted, as we've often said here. And here's another chapter that I think helps demonstrate that. I know that Messiah is coming, who's called the Anointed One. When he's come, he will tell us all things. And Jesus saith unto her, I that speak unto thee am he. I think he's prepared her to accept that claim with the teaching that he's given earlier and with some of these revelations, like verse 18 that he's given earlier. But you need more than that, because, the devil can prophesy or predict something or have some knowledge or insight into some matter. So her heart is really testifying to the fact that the one she is hearing now speak to her is actually this Messiah, this Christ. I that speak unto thee am he. And upon this came his disciples. So we've got an interruption of the conversation, and marveled that he talked with the woman. They're Jews, so we would expect them to marvel. And they are men. We would expect them to marvel. Anybody that accuses us of being, anti-women, they should hear all of our teachings. We're anti-women teaching because the Bible is. We're not anti-women. Jesus is going out of his way to talk to women all the time. I've been accused of so many things that are not true, but that's part of being a true disciple. You get accused of things you didn't say or that are not true. You ought to hear what we're saying tonight. We're saying a lot of positive things about this woman. This woman's going to make it into the kingdom ahead a lot more quickly than a lot of religious denominational people that I know. Yet no man said, "What seekest thou?" or "Why talkest thou with her?" They knew better than that. They knew he had his reasons, although they didn't necessarily understand or weren't completely in agreement with it. The woman then left her water pot and went her way into the city, and saith to the men, "Come." Notice to whom she goes. She doesn't go to the women. She knows she can't get them to believe anything. She goes to the men, but she goes to the men in a new relationship with the men of the city now. No longer the immoral woman of the town, but the one who has come and brought the news of the Messiah. "Come, see a man who told me all things that ever I did." Is not this the Messiah? You have to wonder, were some of those men thinking, well, if I go over there, he's going to start predicting about my past life as well. So if I'm going to go, I'm not going to take my wife with me, that's for sure. Then they went out of the city and came unto him. You got a whole lot here in one long story. Then we need to skip over verses 31 to 38. He's talking to his disciples there. Let's pick back up with the story in verse 39. "And many of the Samaritans of that city believed on him for the saying of the woman, who testified, He told me all that ever I did." Now what's remarkable here is that Jesus performed mighty signs and miracles and wonders right in the presence of the Jewish people in Jerusalem and in Galilee, and they still refused to believe him. Here, all these men have at this point in the narrative is a second-hand report of an immoral woman. And they believe Tahiv is here, the Messiah is here. This chapter is just exploding with the point that the Jewish spirit of hostility toward the Samaritans is grievously in error and is grievously wrong. He did so many wonders and signs and he couldn't get the Jews to believe. Now they've got in Samaria a second-hand report from the immoral woman of the town, and they believe that he's the Messiah. Now they're going to get some further confirmation whenever they hear him themselves, but you got to stay with verse 39 to begin with. They believe because of what she sent, which just says a lot. You can believe things are true, and that is true because someone else tells you that it is. So when the Samaritans were come unto him, they besought him that he would tarry with them, and he abode there 2 days. Now that he must needs go through Samaria takes on even more meaning. I mean, this is why he must needs go through it, is to work salvation in the midst of this land. And many more believed because of his own word, and said unto the woman, Now we believe, not because of thy saying. I mean, she was the one that introduced them. They believed initially because of her, but what they mean is now we've gone beyond that. For we have heard him ourselves, and know that this is indeed the Christ, the Savior of the world.
Great.
Well, marvelous chapter, just marvelous. Let's go on real quickly. I'm running short on time. I didn't know I'd spend so long with John 4. There's the last passage, though, speaking of, in the Gospels, Jesus' friendly attitude toward the Samaritan people. Let's go into early church history. We have a couple of texts here. Acts chapter 1 and verse 8. Early church history. Acts chapter 1 and verse 8. Here again we see Jesus' warm attitude toward the Samaritans in the same way as it's manifested in Matthew 10, 5-6. Okay, they're similar. The Samaritans aren't Jews. The Samaritans aren't the rest of the world either. Acts 1:8. They fall somewhere between Jews and Gentiles, probably because both of their blood and their religion. In Acts 8, 5 through 25, I believe. You could say 5 and following to be safe, but 5 through 25, I believe. We've already discussed the implications of Philip's ministry here, taking the gospel to these people in Samaria whenever we were looking at the Hellenists earlier. But you can note in particular verses 14 through 17, the response of the Jerusalem Christian church. What was it? They were a little suspicious, were they not? Well, let's send the apostles, Peter and John, to go and see what's going on. And they come, inspect it, pray for them to receive the Holy Spirit. They receive. You have the Peter-Simon episode. And then I think around verse 25, you have the disciples going back home, preaching in many villages, we're told, of the Samaritans. Acts 8 around verse 25, or 24, 26, somewhere in that area. 25? Okay, 25. And then, finally, let's move on to what I would just call later Samaritan history. We looked at the Gospels. We looked at early church history, the Acts 1 and Acts 8. Now, later Samaritan history. And I'm going to give you several points under this. Number one, in other words, this is going to cover the next 2,000 years of their history in about 5 minutes. Number one, you may want to look at your notes at the end of ITP message number 59, entitled Pontius Pilate, Part 2. ITP message number 59, Pontius Pilate, Part 2, to see another place in our studies where we've come across the Samaritans. Here in around 36 AD, you have a self-proclaimed Samaritan Tahiv that reveals himself on Mount Gerizim and causes a big problem, and you can go back to your notes on that tape or that message and see what I said about that. That's one place we've come across Samaritans earlier, though. So I just want to put that in here for completeness' sake. Not mentioned in the New Testament, you see, but mentioned in Josephus. Number two would concern the Samaritan reaction to the Roman war against Palestine, AD 67 through 70. Unlike their opportunism shown during the Seleucid invasion several centuries BC, the Samaritans, just like the Jews, chose to resist the Romans in the Roman invasion, AD 66 through 70. If you remember back in the Seleucid invasion, the Samaritans were opportunists. They wanted to escape persecution, so they either gave up their religion or pretended to give it up in face of the Seleucid invasion. But whenever the Romans invade in AD 66 through 70, just like the Jews, the Samaritans choose to resist. And of course that means their death as a consequence. Josephus tells us in Wars, Book 3, Chapter 7, that in AD 67, over 11,000 Samaritans were slain on Mount Gerizim. Two of the early Roman emperors of the early and late 2nd century, Hadrian and Commodus, destroyed much of the sacred writings of the Samaritans. This is why, you go back earlier, I think about the first tape I did on Samaritanism. This is why I said we have very, very little extant Samaritan written material that goes back to early years. Most of it's like 11th century onward. We just have very little early Samaritan material. The reason Hadrian and Commodus, early and late 2nd century AD, destroyed much of the sacred Samaritan writing. But their liturgy, you see, has been so ongoing and so consistent that whatever they're doing today in 1988 will take us back thousands of years in their history. They have been so consistent and ongoing in their liturgy. Even though we can't research all their early history with early original Samaritan documents. They don't go back earlier than the 10th century AD. Number 3. After the Roman persecutions of the first 2 centuries, they experienced their own diaspora and were scattered out into the world. Of course, they had lost their temple to the Jews back in the late 2nd century BC. So they had been established in synagogues ever since then. And it becomes very important, just like for the Jewish people, the synagogue becomes very important in the Samaritan diaspora. For instance, they had important synagogues established at Gaza, at Cairo, and at Damascus, as well as many other places. But those were three important places in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century of the Samaritan diaspora. At Gaza, Cairo, Egypt, and Damascus in Syria. Number 4. Because of their very strongly anti-Christian views, the Roman Emperor Justinian had many, many of them slaughtered. We're just trying to move along chronologically in history. The Arab conquest of Palestine and the Levant in the 7th century A.D. brought the Samaritans untold suffering and death, just like it did for the Jews. The Islamic Arab conquest of Palestine, 600s A.D., brought untold misery, suffering, deprivation, and death to the Samaritans. And I think that especially and specifically from these two episodes, the persecution under the Roman Emperor Justinian and later their persecution under the Arabs, that it was so severe that they never really seemed to fully recover. I mean, they were a populous people. They were very numerous back in first century days. 11,000 being slain on Mount Gerizim in AD 67 is not nearly as tragic as, untold thousands of them slain under the persecutions of Justinian and the Islamic invasion. And then during the next few hundred years, let's go, through the 8th and 9th and 10th century, they were hounded and persecuted and murdered by the Mongols and by the Turks. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that they are rapidly decreasing in number. And then let me conclude on a more positive note with number 5 tonight. All of this history and persecution combined so that by the turn of the 20th century, the Samaritan sect had all but disappeared. For instance, in 1901, they numbered 152. 55 of those were females. You've got to have females as you do males, but you've got to have both to carry on the race. You've got one female for every 2 males. By 1930, they were down to about 90 people. I mean, just think if there were 90 Jews today in the world, 90, not 9 million or something, but 90. This ancient sect of people, there were less than 100 of them in 1930. But starting in the 1940s, and gratefully so, a small turn for the better set in. They began to increase in their population. So that today they number about 600. Still not very many for a whole people, a whole race of people, but they number about 600. With most of those living at, ancient Shechem, it's called Nablus, Nablus today. Ascar is ancient Sychar, and Nablus is ancient Shechem, Nablus. Most of them, let's say like maybe 400 or 500 living at Shechem, and maybe 50 to 100 living at Tel Aviv, and the others at different locations in Palestine. So they appear to be off the endangered species list. But that's still a very small number. Most of them, however, live at Shechem, which is modern Nablus, Nablus. But a large community of them live a little bit northwest of there, up at Tel Aviv.
Racial?
Is it what?
Racial? I mean, do they marry other people out?
Oh, no. And that's something I want to point out here in conclusion. Of course, the problem that the Samaritans have had is the inbreeding, the genetic deficiencies. I mean, that's one of the well-known things about human propagation. Whenever you marry your sister, marries her brother, marries, and you go right down the line and keep marrying people too close to you, what happens? It produces genetic malfunctions and abnormalities right away. That's been one of their problems of ever increasing in size beyond, a few hundred people. They have had problems with retardation and birth defects and things of that order because they do not marry outside the Samaritan clan. And so everybody is related, I mean, very closely related. This great, vast stream of history. Everyone has essentially, the same great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. And everyone's continuing to marry and marry and marry into the clan. And they have had problems with mental disorders, retardation, and various other deficiencies, bodily as well as mental. Spiritually, they're deficient because they're still looking for Tahiv. They should read the Jewish Christian Bible. Of course, they don't believe it. And they should read John 4 and see that he came and some of their ancient ancestors received him and believed him. Today, they still carry on the ancient ritual. I told you I'd bring a picture. I guess I'll conclude Samaritanism with this. Unlike the Jewish people, they still carry on. That's why I said we know a lot about them, and we think we can know a lot about their history because their liturgy has never changed. This is a picture here. You don't find very many of these because they don't like pictures, but of them actually going up, the community of several hundred on top of Gerizim, and they're slaughtering their lambs and offering their sacrifices. They still believe in sacrifice. You see, the Jews don't do that anymore. Passover is the great thing for them. The Jews don't offer sacrifice anymore. I can send this around too. Let me hold it up first of all, though. But when I see his attitude toward the Samaritans in the first advent, I have to wonder about his plan and their role in it in the last days. The second advent of Christ, the millennium. I'm not aware of any specific prophetic teaching about the Samaritan people in the Bible. But if the first advent and his concern for them means anything, then I would have to wonder. It's not just a moot question. I would have to wonder about their role in the last days. Not as though they've got some great role to play, but he sees them as an interesting, unique, in-between group of people.